My beloved child, before you scroll away, pause for just a moment, because there is a reason this message found you now. Somewhere between the words that were never spoken and the feelings that were never fully explained, your soulmate left behind one final letter. And the strange part is this: the letter was not written to make you chase them. It was written because there was something they could no longer keep inside. Stay with me for a moment, because the first few words may seem simple. But what comes after them changes the entire meaning of why they walked away. They began by remembering the smallest things about you, the way you listened, the way you noticed what others ignored, the moments when you made them feel understood without asking a single question. They remembered conversations you probably thought meant nothing. They remembered the silence between your words. And then, near the middle of the letter, they admitted something that may completely change how you see the past: they never stopped caring. They simply became afraid that their own uncertainty would eventually hurt the person they cared about most. As this unfolds, clarity will come. Something huge is waiting for you, but it is not hidden in a dramatic confession. It is hidden in the one sentence they almost erased before sending the letter. They wrote, "I wish I had been brave enough to tell you this sooner." Then they stopped. There was a long space on the page, as though even writing those words had taken everything they had. After that came the memories, the moments when they wanted to reach out but convinced themselves that you had already moved on. The times they opened a message and closed it again. The days they wondered whether you still thought about them. And then came the part they never expected you to understand. They believed leaving quietly would somehow make things easier for you. They thought distance would give you peace. They thought silence would help you heal. But according to the letter, silence did something completely different. It left questions. It left unfinished sentences. It left two people carrying feelings neither one knew how to explain. This may resonate as we continue, because sometimes the deepest connection is not the one that has the most words. It is the one that remains present even after the conversation ends. And just when you think the letter is becoming an apology, the tone changes. They write that there is one truth they have been carrying for far too long. They say meeting you changed the way they understood love, timing, and themselves. They say you showed them a version of their heart they had never met before. And then comes the line that makes the entire letter feel different: "You were never the part of my story I wanted to forget." But there is still one final page. And that page is where the real emotional revelation begins. They admit that they have replayed one particular moment between you again and again, wondering what would have happened if they had made a different choice. They wonder what life would look like if fear had not spoken louder than their feelings. They wonder whether you ever realized how deeply your presence affected them. Then they write something unexpected: "If you ever believed I left because you were not enough, please let that belief go." Those words were not written casually. They were written because they knew their absence might have made you question your worth. They knew you might have blamed yourself for things you could never control. And their final message is not asking you to become someone else, wait forever, or prove anything. Instead, they want you to understand that some endings are created by circumstances, confusion, timing, and choices, not by a lack of value. The letter closes with a sentence that feels almost impossible to read without pausing. If our paths cross again, I hope you meet me as the person you were always meant to become, and I promise I will never look at your heart the same way again. And now you understand why this letter matters. It was never simply about goodbye. It was about everything they could not say while they were standing in front of you. Sometimes the final letter is not the end of a story. Sometimes it is the first moment when the truth finally becomes impossible to hide. There is something they left out of the first page, and this is where the letter takes a completely different turn. The handwriting becomes slower, almost as if every sentence was difficult to finish. They wrote about the last time they saw you, but they described it differently than you remember. While you may have thought they were calm, distant, or already moving on, they confessed that they were fighting an emotional battle inside themselves. They wanted to say something, but they were afraid that once the words came out, there would be no way to take them back. Stay with me for a moment, because this next part explains why their silence may have felt so confusing. They admitted that they kept asking themselves one question: what if I tell them how I really feel, and everything changes? That question followed them long after you were gone. They carried it through ordinary days, quiet nights, familiar places, and moments when something unexpectedly reminded them of you. And then they confessed something even more surprising. They had imagined writing this letter many times before, but every time they stopped because they believed you deserved someone who could speak without hesitation. They knew they had left you with unanswered questions, and deep down, they knew those questions deserved answers. Then came the paragraph they almost never wrote. They said there was a moment when they realized that missing you was not simply about missing your presence. They missed the person they became when they were around you. They missed being understood without having to explain every feeling. They missed the comfort of knowing someone could see beyond their strongest face. And that realization frightened them because it made them understand that what they had dismissed as a passing connection had become something much deeper. As this unfolds, clarity will come, because the letter reveals that they were not only thinking about the past, they were quietly wondering about the future. They wondered whether you would ever forgive them for the things they left unsaid. They wondered whether you would still recognize the person behind their silence. Most importantly, they wondered whether you had already closed the door in your heart. Then they wrote a sentence that changes everything: I don't know if I still have a place in your life, but I needed you to know that you had a place in mine. Imagine reading those words after believing the connection meant more to you than it ever meant to them. Suddenly, every unanswered question feels different. Every quiet moment carries another meaning. Every memory becomes part of a story that was never completely finished. And here is where I want you to pause and really listen. This may resonate as we continue, because sometimes people discover the value of something only after they no longer have easy access to it. The letter says they learned that lesson slowly. They began noticing how many ordinary moments reminded them of you. A song. A familiar phrase. A place you once talked about. Even a simple conversation could suddenly bring back a memory they thought they had buried. But they were not writing to manipulate your emotions. They were writing because they finally understood that keeping everything hidden had created a heavier burden than telling the truth. If this message is connecting with you, share it with someone who may need to hear these words, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you do not miss the next part of this story. Because the final paragraph of the letter contains the one confession they were most afraid to write. And trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. Something huge is waiting for you, not necessarily in the form you expect, but in the truth hidden behind their final words. The last section begins with only 6 words, "There is one thing left." Then they explain that throughout the entire connection, they were searching for certainty. They wanted to know exactly where everything was going before allowing themselves to fully surrender to the feeling. But life never gave them that certainty. Instead, it gave them moments, small, unexpected, unforgettable moments with you. And now they realize they spent too much time waiting for a perfect answer instead of appreciating what was already real. They write, "If I could rewrite one part of our story, I would not erase you. I would erase the hesitation that kept me from telling you what you meant to me." Then they leave one final thought: whatever happens from here, please never believe that you were insignificant to me. The letter ends there, but the emotion does not. Because sometimes the most powerful message is not, "Come back." Sometimes it is simply, "I finally understand." And perhaps that is why these words found you today. Not to pull you backward, but to help you see the past with clearer eyes. Their final letter may have been about them, but the lesson hidden inside it is about you. You were never required to beg for clarity, chase an explanation, or question your worth. You deserved the truth then, and you deserve peace now. But there is still one detail about this letter that has not been revealed yet, and that detail may explain why they chose to leave it until the very end. Something changed the moment they reached the final page, because the words there were no longer about what happened between you. They were about what they realized after you were gone. "My beloved child," they admitted that for a long time they had been telling themselves a story. That leaving was the mature thing to do, that silence was better than complicated conversations, and that eventually the memories would become quieter. But instead, something unexpected happened. The more time passed, the more clearly they understood what they had lost. Stay with me for a moment, because this is where the letter reveals the emotion they tried hardest to hide. They wrote that they began remembering not only the beautiful moments, but also the moments when you needed reassurance and they did not know how to give it. They remembered questions they avoided, conversations they postponed, and opportunities they allowed to disappear. And the most painful realization was this: they had been waiting for the perfect moment to speak, while you were simply waiting for honesty. Then came a sentence that made the entire letter feel like a confession. "I thought time would make me forget you, but time only made me understand you." They finally understood that some people do not leave your heart simply because they leave your life. Their presence becomes part of the way you think, the way you remember, and the way you understand what truly matters. But then the letter revealed something even more personal. They said there was one memory they kept returning to, a moment so ordinary that you may never have realized how important it was to them. You were simply being yourself. You were not trying to impress anyone, you were not asking for anything, and you probably did not even know they were watching closely. But they remembered your expression, your words, and the feeling they had in that exact moment. They wrote that this was when they first realized their feelings were deeper than they wanted to admit. As this unfolds, clarity will come, because this explains why their behavior sometimes seemed contradictory. One moment they felt close to you, the next, they pulled away. One day they seemed ready to open their heart, the next, they became distant. According to the letter, the distance was never proof that you meant nothing. It was evidence that they were struggling to understand what you meant to them. They were afraid of making a promise they could not guarantee. They were afraid of disappointing you. And most of all, they were afraid that if they allowed themselves to believe in the connection completely, losing it would hurt even more. So they chose control over vulnerability. They chose silence over uncertainty. And now, looking back, they finally recognize the price of that choice. This may resonate as we continue, because the next words are not what you might expect from someone leaving a final letter. They did not ask you to wait. They did not demand another chance. They did not tell you to stop living your life. Instead, they wrote, "Please keep becoming the person you were becoming before I came into your life." That sentence carries an entirely different kind of emotion. It means they recognized something they had perhaps never said aloud. Your future cannot depend on whether someone stays. Your worth cannot be measured by whether someone chooses you. And your healing cannot be postponed until another person finally explains themselves. They wanted you to know that whatever happened between you, your life was never supposed to become smaller because of it. Then they wrote about the possibility of meeting again, not as a promise, but as a thought they could not completely dismiss. If life ever brings us to the same place again, they wrote, I hope we meet without the fear that once stood between us. And then came the line that makes the entire letter feel almost unfinished, because if I ever get the chance to speak to you again, there is something I would finally say without hesitation. Something huge is waiting for you, and now you can feel the suspense building around those unfinished words. What exactly would they say? Why did they stop there? And why would someone leave the most important sentence for the very end? The answer appears in the final lines, but it is not written as a dramatic declaration. It is quieter than that, and somehow that makes it more powerful. They wrote, "Thank you for loving the parts of me I was still learning to accept." Then they admitted that your presence had taught them something they could not learn from anyone else. Sometimes the person who changes your life is not the person who stays beside you forever, but the person who makes you see yourself differently. They apologized for the moments when their silence made you question yourself. They apologized for every time you wondered whether you mattered. And then they wrote the words they had been avoiding from the beginning, "You mattered more than I ever knew how to explain." The letter ends, but one question remains. Why did they call it a final letter if they still had something left to say? That mystery is the piece we have not uncovered yet. And when we reach it, you may understand why this letter was never really about saying goodbye. It was about finally telling the truth after there was nothing left to hide. The final page was folded differently from the others, and that tiny detail changes everything. My beloved child, what looked like an ordinary goodbye suddenly becomes something much deeper, because beneath the final paragraph was one last handwritten note they had almost removed. It began with a simple sentence, "If you are reading this, then I finally found the courage." Stay with me for a moment, because those words explain why this letter existed at all. They admitted that every version of the letter they had written before this one was filled with excuses, explanations, and things they thought would make leaving easier to understand. But this time, they wanted no excuses. They wanted only honesty. They wrote that they had spent too much time trying to appear certain when, inside, they were full of questions. They wanted to seem strong, but they were carrying memories they could not simply turn off. They wanted to believe that moving forward meant forgetting, but eventually they realized that forgetting was never necessary. Some connections become part of you without needing to control your future. And then they wrote something that may be the most important message of the entire letter. I don't want you to remember me as the person who walked away. Remember me as the person who finally understood what you meant. Those words completely changed the emotional meaning of everything that came before them. Then came the confession they had kept hidden behind every other sentence. They admitted that there were moments when they almost returned, not because they were lonely, not because they wanted attention, but because they genuinely wondered whether the story between you deserved another conversation. They would imagine what they might say if they stood in front of you again. They imagined apologizing without defending themselves. They imagined listening instead of explaining. They imagined looking into your eyes and finally saying the words they had once been too uncertain to speak. But each time, they stopped themselves because they did not want to interrupt the life you were building. As this unfolds, clarity will come. They were not asking you to put your life on hold. They were acknowledging that you deserved the freedom to move forward without carrying their unfinished emotions. This may resonate as we continue, because sometimes closure does not arrive when another person comes back. Sometimes closure arrives when you finally understand that their silence was never a measurement of your worth. And then the letter reaches its most unexpected moment. They write, if you have already found peace, please protect it. If you are still healing, please be patient with yourself. And if you ever remember me, remember the good without reopening the pain. Those words are not a demand. They are a release. And before the letter ends, there is one final message for you. They write that they hope someday you will understand how rare it was to be known by someone who could see beyond appearances. They remembered your patience, your small acts of kindness, and the moments when you made them feel safe enough to be imperfect. They said those moments became more valuable with time, not less. Then they wrote, I once thought losing you would be the saddest part of my story. Now I realize never telling you the truth would have been. That sentence is the emotional center of the entire letter. Because the truth they finally understood was not simply that they missed you. It was that they had allowed fear, timing, and uncertainty to speak louder than their heart. And now they could no longer change the past. But they could give you something they should have given you much earlier, clarity. If this story has stayed with you, share it with someone who may need these words, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that speak to the emotions people often struggle to express. Not because you need to chase an ending, but because sometimes hearing the truth helps you finally release the questions you have carried for too long.